Ivy and Gecko acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Welcome to Hearts and Minds. Our podcast episodes feature conversations with highly accomplished mining executives and board directors. We'll explore critical themes relating to leadership impact, staff engagement and culture development. So tune in, enjoy the conversations and prepare to be inspired. I'm Alana Bray-White, the Managing Director of Ivy and Gecko, and this is our podcast, Hearts and Minds.
A company's culture comes from the top dog. Theoretically, people talk about building a culture from the bottom up and the top down. I have seen, without exception, every organization's culture dictated and determined by the behaviors, the words of the person who is the top dog, who makes all the decisions.
At the executive level, Clayton, or the board level, or both?
Whoever the person is who identifies as the top person. If you look, whether it's a CEO or whether it's a senior board member, whether it's the owner of the business.
Our guest today is Clayton Timms. Clayton is qualified in strategic human resources and has acquired extensive international experience across the mining, oil and gas and manufacturing industries. Having led the development and implementation of complex integrated systems involving mission-critical functions like safety, competency development, leadership effectiveness and organisational transition, Clayton speaks with authority on many aspects of mining operations best practice. In particular, this episode explores how to build value in productive working relationships, even in the face of adverse market conditions and corporate uncertainty. We hope our listeners and viewers will take some learning from Clayton's insights and apply them to their own situations. Please enjoy this episode.
Clayton Timms, welcome to Hearts and Minds.
Thanks, David. Great to be here.
Not only, I reckon, are you the most travelled guest I've had on this podcast, but you're also the best dressed.
Well, I'll tell my wife that.
Well, thanks for making the effort.
She will claim this. She got the tie for me. I'm not allowed to select my own ties.
I'm so pleased to have you on the program because, amongst other things, you are so well experienced across multiple jurisdictions and had exposure to a lot of different leadership practices. If I'm right, I think you've worked on projects and operations across 17 countries.
That's right, yes.
And that's across both mining and oil and gas.
Yes.
And to boot, you've been subjected to a terrorist action along the way. So we're really keen to hear about that a little bit later. Before we talk about leadership and your approach to engaging stakeholders and your perspectives on culture development within businesses, Clayton, let's go back in time. Let's talk about your early years. Where did you grow up and what was it like?
I grew up in an industrial town in South Africa called Uitenhage, better known for, in those days, well, up until recent years, all the left-hand drive Volkswagens in Australia were made in the factory there. Goodyear was the other big manufacturing concern, and there was a whole range of parts manufacturers, if you like, for those industries. I was schooled in the oldest school in South Africa. This year it's 150 years old. So a lot of tradition, absolutely amazing environment to grow up as a kid.
So we're talking the 70s here, are we?
Yes, the 70s. Schooling, I sort of went through school up until 1980, so 70s would be the era. I call it the outdoor era. We had wonderful neighbours, so there must have been about 30 or 40 kids of similar ages, and we were always out in the streets on bicycles and skateboards and cricket and tennis. We actually became known locally as the Springs Avenue Muggers because cars couldn't travel down the road because the kids were always outside.
Yeah,
so
you look that threatening.
No, it's just the volume of kids running around on all sorts of equipment that I think people got a bit nervous coming down the street. So absolutely a wonderful place to grow up. About 7 hours drive from Cape Town, just from a perspective for people who don't know the area. So yeah, absolutely wonderful. I call it the outdoor era. long before we had technology to keep us indoors. I think the difference today is you've got kids that get punished, they get sent outdoors. When we were punished, we were locked in our rooms. I think kids today would love the opportunity to be locked in their rooms.
Thinking back to your early years in the 70s, apartheid was still alive and well as a practice. Talk about the influence or the impact that had on you growing up.
Very much so. As growing up as a white youngster in that environment, you were privileged, no doubt about it. The times weren't the best in terms of that, but as I said, growing up as a youngster, you were sort of protected until you left school and you were forced into 2 years national service. I spent my national service in the Air Force, up in the operational area. At the same time, in the 70s, 1975, if I'm not mistaken, there was a war on the border between Southwest Africa, Namibia today, and Angola, and we were involved. 17, 18, 19-year-olds were involved in active combat.
Is that still a requirement, national service?
No. It's, in those days, the South African Air Force and Defence Force was ranked as some of the top in the world. Today, it's actually an embarrassment. I read the other day that I think they've only got 6 aircraft that are still operational, that can be flown. Forget about combat or anything like that. No, it's to put it plainly, it's become a bit of an embarrassment. The pride that there used to exist and the strength and for the protection of the country, I suppose, just doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I think there seems to be a bit of a renewed push for national service in many countries, given the age of nationalism that seems to be covering the world at the moment. What about school, Clayton? Did you enjoy the school?
I actually loved school. Schooling in South Africa in those days was there was a lot of discipline. So if you were coming from outside, just a little anecdote, my uncle was a very well-known rugby league player in Wigan. He left South Africa to play rugby league in Wigan. He came over to Australia. They emigrated to Australia. My cousins were born here. So he came over. He actually was involved with the Sydney Bears, which I see is about to be revitalised in the West.
That's right. What are we to be called? The Western Bears?
It sounds like it, yeah. So yeah, we've got a long history with Oz. Going back to the schooling, my uncle wanted to go back to South Africa, so they came back to Cape Town also in the 70s. But my cousins struggled. They were brought up in very different schooling environment, and the discipline from a schooling in those days they struggled with. So they only lasted a few years before they got in a ship to Fremantle and ended up in Perth.
Yeah, wow. And as a youth, did you have any sort of firm opinion as to what career path you'd be taking later in life?
There were a few events that I suppose made me grow up very quickly. One thing with the national service, something I would strongly advise countries to do. You grow up very quickly. As a youngster, you learn about discipline. To this day, I still do my own ironing because you taught those skills that seem to disappear as a youngster, and you learn to do these things for yourself. So the one thing that I realized after the army, I went to uni, and we traveled on. In my first year, there was a group of us that traveled. We were part of the Anthropological Society, and we traveled Europe. And something struck me on those tours is how judgmental people were to anyone who was from South Africa. You were immediately identified as an anti-apartheid or an apartheid supporter. You were judged for what was going on, even though you, as a youngster, had very little influence. You know, in those days, as I said, you either went to the army for 2 years or you went to jail.
I mean, there were boycotts, weren't they, against South
Yeah,
African sporting teams, cricket and rugby?
Unfortunately, from a sporting point of view, let's get to cricket. Bill Lawry was the last one to realise how good the South African cricket team was in those days.
And the tall Englishman, the captain of England,
Tony Gregg.
Tony Gregg. Yeah, I mean he moved to England, didn't he, in order to?
That's right. Yeah, a lot of Basil de Oliveira, who became very well known as one of the anti-apartheid movers, because he was excluded purely because of his colour.
Yeah.
In those days. But the thing that struck me was how you were, and it transcends your life as a youngster, you were judged as being part of the problem. Yes. People never try to find out what your political beliefs were and what you supported. They just judged you. Right. And I suppose the one thing that to this day, when I watch what's happening going on around the world, and whether it's Russia, and the issues over there, whether it is what's happening in the Middle East, I've learned that before you start judging people, you've got to walk a mile in another man's shoes. And I think society today, unfortunately, has got too many keyboard warriors. Yes. When you start digging deeper, they have very strong opinions. But when you start digging, those opinions are based on nothing. And this is where the concern is, where I think the world has to get back to having proper conversations. And I think this is where leadership becomes so important, is you've got to guide those conversations, that you can have a rational conversation. You can differ, but the important thing is to try and understand where the other person is coming from before judging. I grew up being judged without being given the opportunity to be listened to.
And being judged, has that been a load that you've carried with you throughout much of your life, or have you sort of come to terms with it and rationalise the hypocrisy that others may have towards South Africans generally?
I think, fortunately, I've always been a very strong personality in terms of standing up for myself. So that's never defined me. It taught me to be more critical in my thinking and the way that I take a position, or before I take a position. But I've always been prepared to stand, and it's one of the things that anyone who knows me will tell you, that I'm not worried about being unpopular. My values are what drive everything that I do in life. And it doesn't matter what resistance I get, I will always stand on those values, because that's all I take with me when I leave one day.
I think you've begun there, Clayton, to describe and define the qualities and the behaviours of leadership. Now, I mentioned previously that you are so well travelled and exposed to diverse ethnicities and cultures. Let's dig a bit deeper into leadership. What does it mean to you? And you've referred to empathy, walking a mile in someone else's shoes. What are the other characteristics of good leadership?
Well, when you talk about leadership in an organisational context, there are two critical factors that you have to consider. When one moves up levels within an organisation, there's one thing that by implication defines the differences, and that's complexity. And if you look into stratified systems in more detail, there are 14 criteria that have got different levels of complexity. So if you're talking about leadership at the front line level, so i.e. a supervisor or a foreman or a team lead in an organisation, moving up to a superintendent, to a manager, to a senior manager, to a director, to a board member, the one thing that differs is complexity. Now, so the one component of leadership is critical, is understanding whether a person has got the cognitive complexity to deal with an increased level of leadership responsibility. But that's only one part of it. The second part are the attributes. So in other words, what are your dominant traits as a person? because those traits drive your behaviors. So if I am if I've got a high level of integrity, now all of these things you can assess in a person. You can assess the cognitive potential of a person, you can assess what their dominant traits are. So leadership is about identifying those traits at the level at which they need to operate and the behaviors that go with it. So if I'm going to show empathy, it's very difficult for me to show empathy if I don't have personality traits that support me being empathetic, me being a good listener, me being open and honest. So there are traits that underpin that. So when I talk about leadership, especially within an organizational context, I'm not talking about the informal leadership. I'm talking about leadership in a formal, structured environment, which most organizations are. And I look back at the success of leaders that I've respected in my life, as opposed to those that I don't. You can generally find it in the traits that their behaviors are exhibited through. So it's a pretty holistic approach that one's got to take when you start looking at leadership. In terms of what I have found personally, I am by nature an incredibly open and honest person. I was told by one of my first directors way back in my career that I'm too honest. And I never understood what he meant. Eventually I understood it. And what that meant was you can be honest in a way that harms someone else. So it's good to be honest, but you've got to also be empathetic in terms of that honesty. I think, however, having said that, I've always been very open with people. I will say to them, this is the situation, these are the options, and these are the consequences of those options. You've got to choose. But I'm not going to powder something if it's not going to be in your best interest by me doing that.
I think linked to the honesty that you refer to, Clayton, and the transparency is vulnerability. It's clear to me and the research that I've read on the topic that if people perceive that you have a degree of humility and you share your vulnerabilities or weaknesses or gaps in knowledge or skill, they are more encouraged to place their trust in you because they perceive that you don't think you have all the answers and you do rely on other people, teamwork, to perform a task or work on a project successfully. So you've raised a number of leadership qualities there, starting with empathy, I think, and listening and transparency and sharing your vulnerabilities. All of these are important for fostering trust-based relationships.
I think the vulnerability bit is pretty important, especially when it comes to, we all make mistakes, but it's owning up to those mistakes and being honest and accepting. And one of the things I think that I have discovered which worries me is people's lack of accountability. It is too easy to always find fault. Without getting into politics, something with the recent elections, Adam Bant, I've noticed that he's not accountable for anything. It's always someone else. And people see through that. You know, one of the things that I've always said is stop trying to treat people as idiots. People are clever. No matter how you try and manipulate a message, they will sense it. It's the old Aussie saying, you know, does it pass the pub test? People sense these things. You don't have to be a master's degree graduate to figure things out. The way people behave and the way people are treated is a gut instinct. It's not a cranial thing that people generally worry about. It's what do I sense in that person. And leadership is a lot about what you sense in a person. Yes. And if you sense that they are genuine, they will be prepared to go along with you even when they don't necessarily agree, because they trust you. Yes. They trust the sense that they are getting from you and how you are treating them.
It's a very good point. I know you are a student of competency development and leadership capabilities. It appears to me that being focused on the mining industry, as we both are, Clayton, that when you look at the top-level executives within a business, typically they're technocrats. They are technically trained and educated individuals, very smart, who rise the ranks. They rise the hierarchy typically to get to the C-suite level without a great deal of training in terms of relationship skills development. It strikes me that many people at the very senior levels struggle to understand how to cultivate relationships with other people. What's the answer to that? Because we know that the biggest single reason why individuals leave organisations is because of an erosion of respect and trust towards their direct manager. So what's the solution to people leaving organisations because of poor people management?
People don't leave organisations, they leave bosses. So it's very seldom that you'll find a person that feels they have to resign. It's because of the organisation per se. It's more likely to be either their direct leader or leaders up the ranks. It's a difficult question in the sense that it goes back to the inherent traits of that person. So I'll give an example without naming names or organisations. I used to work for a general manager who's he is the most incredibly intelligent person I have ever worked for. But he was, and is still, shocking when it comes to dealing with people issues. I think the problem exists when you try and intellectualize a personal issue and you try and deal with it on an intellectual level. So if that is your go-to, if that is part of your makeup, it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to change that. You can make people aware, and I think the whole issue of emotional intelligence is pretty important. So things like emotional intelligence can be used to try and make people aware. I am a firm believer, and I've seen it too many times to believe anything else, is that your inherent abilities is what defines what you're going to be like. One of the truisms in my environment as an org development person my whole career is that past behavior predicts future behavior. So if you are wanting to know how a person is going to behave, dig into the past and find out how they've behaved in the past in similar situations, and that will tell you how they're going to behave in the future. A person can only manipulate their own behaviors for very short spaces of time, because when stress takes over, you go back to your default.
Yes.
And that's when the true you comes out. So what you see in public and what you see in an interview very often is not the true behaviors that you are looking for. Now,
professional role playing too.
It is. And unfortunately, I think this has been a problem that I've had, because in interviews, I generally tend to be the way I am. And I think it puts people off because they think I'm acting. I go home, that's the way I behave with my family and my friends. At work, that's the way that I behave. I've got I suppose, a bit of a wicked sense of humour. And I tend to use that sometimes inappropriately, but that's who I am. I'm not going to change who I am so that someone thinks. If you're ever going to employ me, you employ me for who I am, not who you think I am.
Yeah.
And I think this is where people make the mistake, is they look at what they see in front of them, and just to add to that, there's something that I've noticed which really worries me is how a lot of senior execs believe that by talking to someone they can see that person's potential. It is probably one of the most arrogant things I have ever heard and dealt with. And yet, you go and speak to someone and say, we need to start looking at potential from a different way. And they say, no, I've got this covered. I know what that person's potential is, which assumes they have got mind reading and futuristic capabilities.
What would be a better approach?
There is only one approach, and that's to use as part of looking at the person's potential key psychometric assessments. So there are ones that look at your cognitive abilities in terms of your ability to operate at more levels of seniority and therefore complexity. And there are certain traits that are going to support that as opposed to others. So that has to be, that to me is ground zero. If you are not doing that, you just go and Google for yourself. Go and find out the difference between potential and performance. Performance is observable. I can see you because performance is something that is current. Potential is in the future. And unless you've got a crystal ball, you can't determine what that potential is. There are assessments that actually predict that incredibly accurate.
Yeah. Well said, and I think it underlines the importance of people considering what competencies somebody has as opposed to looking only at their past experience. We know that people have underlying behavioural competencies which they may not put into practice because in their current role and environment they don't have an opportunity to display those competencies. So I think it's very important that sometimes employers of senior people or anybody for that matter take the blinkers off and look very hard and at the base competencies, not just the CV.
I'll give you an example of one of the mines that I worked for. There was the first HRD had left, and there was a gap of a few months before they were going to employ the replacement. I was asked by the CEO at the time to put people through that, the applicants, through psychometrics, specifically to look at cognitive complexity. The person who was eventually employed, I had to sit down with the CEO and I said, this person is not a fit for the role because they are probably 2 levels cognitively below what the role requires. I was told by the CEO that all the reference checks, the moment someone says reference check, I have a chuckle because I've never heard of anyone giving a name of someone who gives them a bad reference check. So all the reference checks said this person was fantastic. Well, they employed the individual. The individual lasted probably a year or 2 before the person was moved on, simply because they were not able to cope with that level of complexity of that role. When we first did the assessments, the CEO said to me, no, doesn't believe it. So I said, do me a favor, seal that in an envelope, put it in your drawer and write 6 months on it. And then let's have this conversation again. He never ever had the conversation with me again, but the individual was moved on.
Yeah. A lot of people would agree with you regarding reference checks, and you're quite right. On the back end of a CV, sometimes you'll find nominated individuals. What I prefer to do, and I still believe in reference checking, but not necessarily contacting the people that the candidate first offers me. I ask the candidate for permission to speak with individuals that I think would give me an interesting perspective and point of view on the behaviour of that person. Typically it might be a former boss, but it may be an external contractor. It could be a customer. So there are a variety of different people that you potentially can approach and ask for, frank feedback on somebody. And they may not be listed on the back end of the CV. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Let's talk a little bit about culture. You're very experienced in the mining context. Is there an ideal end state for a culture of a mining business? If so, what does it look like?
Okay, so let's dig a bit deeper into this. This is something that I've seen so many good and even more poor examples of this. Let me give you 3 examples, and let's come back to talk about what it looks like. I think first thing to note, and I will challenge anyone on this because I will show you the examples and I'll explain some of them now. A company's culture comes from the top dog. Theoretically, people talk about building a culture from the bottom up and the top down. I have seen, without exception, every organization's culture dictated and determined by the behaviors, the words of the person who is the top dog, who makes all the decisions.
At the executive level, Clayton, or the board level, or both?
Whoever the person is who identifies as the top person. If you look, whether it's a CEO or whether it's a senior board member, whether it's the owner of the business, without going into the 2 organizations, because I don't know them, but if you just look at Gina Reinhardt and you look at Fortescue, you can look at the culture and you can look back at the 2 leaders of them, with Triggy Forrest, and you will see their personalities, their behaviors coming through in the culture of their businesses. But let me give you specific examples of where I was involved. One example was probably the best cultural change in a business I have ever been a part of was Volkswagen in South Africa. Those days, you might be familiar with Tom Peters and Bob Waterman in Search of Excellence. We put in place Peter Searle, who was probably the most phenomenal leader that I have still been exposed to in my career. He said in those days Volkswagen was 12% of the South African car market, and he believed that there was a leadership change needed, and there were 5 of us that were party with him to bring in a program to change how the business is led. It was a 7-year intervention. Within the first 2 years of putting in Search of Excellence, of which we were actually awarded by Tom Peters himself the world's best implementation of it, Volkswagen had jumped from 12 to, I think at that stage they doubled the market share. So in the first 2 years of changing the leadership culture, today they are in the 50% plus of the South African car market. Now, where the importance of culture was, 3 years down the track, I would be running a review session with the manufacturing director and his full team. And if one of those managers was not in attendance, Peter Searle himself would come down. He was in an ivory tower in the plant with 10,000 people. He would come into that review session 3 years into this program, and he would reiterate what he said in the beginning. You are either on this bus or you are off this bus. That is how you drive culture. You drive culture change through signaling it as a leader. Another example was I was asked to go to Qatar to help with putting in place a values program for a company called Mishreb, which was part of the Qatar Foundation. I'd been there for about 3 months, and they developed fantastic glossy programs to train everyone in. And they had a CEO who was a massive man in personality and in stature. He treated people as his private fiefdom. You won't believe what I'm telling you now, but there was a building in Doha, it was a round building where our offices were. he would go out and he would take a bell, one of those little bells that you ring for tea, and he would walk around and he would ring the bell and people would have to come out of the offices and follow him. Now, there is no ways on this earth that you are going to put in place a values program that is not directly the same as that man's behaviors. After 9 months, they listened to me and they canned the whole program. I had a similar case in Australia with one of my previous mines, where they had spent over $2 million on a values program. I can't tell you the examples in too much detail because it'll tell you who it was. But when you have people coming into a business as part of their orientation already saying, but hang on, this is not how we understand this business from seeing it in the market and hearing people. Again, I eventually convinced the CEO to can the program because it was doing more damage than it was doing good. So, and it comes back to the same thing. It comes back to the leadership, how they talk about things, but more importantly, how they are seen to behave about the whatever the values are that they're trying to create. So talk about culture, go to the top dog, and you will see it without having to run programs.
And now we take a short break to acknowledge our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by Halo Civil Engineering. Halo is a multidiscipline civil contractor that specialises in the delivery of complex civil projects across defence, infrastructure, energy and resources. A West Australian company committed to delivering dynamic solutions with a focus on zero harm, while having a positive impact on their industry, clients and the people they serve. For more information, search for Halo Civil Engineering on socials or visit halocivil.com.
Is your business ready to amplify its voice? At Podwave Studios, we offer professional video podcast production services that help you connect with clients, build your brand, and grow your audience. From corporate messaging to thought leadership, we've got you covered. Book your session at podwavestudios.au today.
As the only executive search and leadership consulting firm to be admitted membership of the Minerals Council of Australia, Ivy & Gecko is uniquely resourced to advocate for the interests of our exploration, project development and mining clients.
Yeah, the individual behaviour of leaders is absolutely central to the development of culture. There's no question about that. I mean, not only do leaders need to create the conditions to allow and enable people to grow and realise more of their potential, but they have to inspire, they have to communicate a vision and show a degree of optimism and enthusiasm that we can get there. You know, we all see examples of very good leaders and we see examples of fairly poor leaders as well. I remember, Clayton, reading the book Legacy, which is about the All Blacks.
Yep.
No doubt you've read it, and the humility that the senior management and the coaches and the players showed was absolutely amazing. They cleaned their own changing rooms. It was part of the practice of wearing the jersey. They were not above cleaning their change rooms, picking up rubbish, greeting their fans after the match. It was just such an example of leadership at the various levels.
You must remember, I lived through the pain of those years of the All Blacks being as dominant as they were. But you're right; it's you can see it in the current South African back-to-back world champions, Rassie Erasmus. You want to go and look at leadership and the difference it can make through lived values and behaviours. There's not a better current example of it. It's just phenomenal when your leaders get it right. Unfortunately, as you said earlier on, is very often people get promoted based on their technical abilities.
Yes.
And you hope like hell that they've got leadership that's going to carry those technical abilities, which often it doesn't.
Yeah. What would you describe as perhaps the biggest challenge from a people and leadership perspective? What's the biggest challenge facing the mining industry today?
I think from a leadership point of view, one that looks no further than the makeup of your workforce. You know, if you go back to boomers, like you and I probably are, and what was important to us, as opposed to youngsters. I don't know what alphabet they're using anymore. There've been so many iterations of this, but you look at youngsters coming through and what's important to them. Very different. So from a leadership point of view, if you are working not only in a multicultural environment, which most businesses are today, but if you are working in a what is the right term to use, a multi-age environment, people have got different drivers. You talk about EVPs and what drives people. Youngsters today look for something different in leaders. But I think some of the core things remain the same. Doesn't matter who you're dealing with. The issue of respect, respecting people for who they are and the differences that they might bring, being open to listening to different opinions, irrespective of where those opinions come from, and giving them equal validation and importance, being prepared to listen to different perspectives without going back to, as my kids very often accuse me of, you're going back to thinking as a boomer, and the values that were important then. So it's really a question of having those core behaviors and values, and being able to apply your. People talk very glibly about things like active listening. And it's critically important is the other thing is also don't try and give people the solutions. Help them find the solutions for themselves. Critical thinking, I think, is something that is not paid enough attention to in businesses. There's actually which I'll send you, there's a brilliant podcast at the moment, a young teacher, and funnily enough, it was in the multimedia, I just saw it just the other day, of where he came on with a position about a person. And all this guy did was he said, I'm not going to respond to your question. Let's investigate this. And he started getting the guy to question what he had originally said. And it was amazing. At the end, this youngster said to him, he said, I'm actually quite embarrassed about the statement that I made at the beginning of this discussion. And it's the whole question of critical thinking. And I think we need to, as leaders, get back to helping people think for themselves as opposed to telling them what the answers are.
Yeah, and I think there isn't enough emphasis placed on critical reasoning in the education system. It's more about rote learning.
Is there any?
Yeah, correct. So I think you've hit a very important point there, critical thinking. And also you raised diversity a while ago. I think people are overly focused on diversity of gender and ethnicity. What is important is diversity of point of view, whatever package that comes to you in. And if you have people who are prepared and feel safe and comfortable to challenge you and offer their point of view on a topic, as opposed to you working in an echo chamber full of people who you've selected because they agree with you, that's very important for leaders to develop teams with a diverse point of view. And it seems to me in places like the US, where diversity and equity and inclusion, from a legislative point of view, those practices seem to be winding back now. There is a push by the anti-woke community to do away with all of this diversity practice, which is a little bit concerning, I think.
I think the problem for me comes in with programs like DEI, and I say programs because that's what they are. When you embark on something like DEI, to my mind, it is critical that you identify when it's been successful. Otherwise, you perpetuate and you double down on the same approach and program without knowing when it's actually achieved what it was designed to achieve. And you also have to keep in mind that with a program like diversity, and I come from a country where they have got plenty of race-based laws. Remember that when you initiate a program like diversity, the aim of it is to favor certain groups. But remember, there are other groups that are being disfavored because of that program. So the question to me is less as to whether you need something like diversity, but what constitutes success, that you have this pendulum resting back in the middle. With a lot of these programs, and I think this is why there's been such a blowback, is that it has gone from one extreme to the next. So the pendulum is sitting, it can't go any further in terms of bias towards certain groups and treatment of others. And this is when people start becoming resentful, and it's happening in Australia.
It seems to me that people need to include before they think about diversity. I mean, there's no point having a diversity of point of view or a diverse group of people if you don't include them.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it's important to look at all of the components of it. We're getting towards the end of our session here. It's been very interesting. Before we go on to the rapid fire questions, I do want to ask you for an opinion or share your experience with this Mali incident that we all know about. Resolute Mining, the executives were effectively taken hostage. Tell us about it, and what was your involvement in the incident?
The involvement was purely a timing issue. Prior to myself and my boss, who was the HRD at the time, going to Mali, he was based in London, I was based in Perth. We were meeting in Mali and Senegal to do an analysis of some of the challenges and put in place interventions to improve a whole range of matters, from leadership through to technical skills. And as things are in Africa, they can change overnight. We had been in the country probably for 2 or 3 weeks at that point in time. Our COO was flying back to Cape Town. He got on a charter flight with a few of our colleagues. We, at that stage, were staying on for longer. And they flew off to Bamako Airport, only to be radioed as they were approaching the runway that they were being diverted because there was a full-blown terrorist attack taking place at the airport. They had just attacked a police training college, army training college, 5 kilometers outside of the airport, and they were busy shooting up parts of the airport as the flight was coming into land. So they were diverted to a fairly remote airport until the terrorists had been mopped up and could return to Bamako and find their international flights again. And it's an unfortunate thing, you know, if you look at that area, been born in Africa, I fought a war in Africa, I've worked with a number of organizations across Africa. There's certain parts of the continent that are always going to be problematic. The area up where Mali is called the Sahel. There's a lot of tribal warfare. Most of the countries there have become military juntas. Terry, who was the CEO, went up because the military government had imposed, they just made up amounts of money that each mine owed them. Resolute were told that they owed them $183 million for ludicrous tax evasion issues. And the thing is, you've got to remember, with the military government, they don't have to prove anything to anyone.
It's not really an invitation for other project developers and mining companies to invest in that country now.
And look, and then Terry went there obviously with the best intentions to try and negotiate on behalf of the business. What happened was, unfortunately, good intentions don't always work in those parts of the continent. He was arrested, literally taken hostage until the company paid the $183 million. What they had also done is all mines over there, you would have seen with Barrick as well, fighting the new taxes that are being imposed. Barrick has also been told that they have to pay, I don't know what the amounts are. Yesterday there was news again of a convoy being attacked by terrorists. One of the other gold mines up there, they were attacked carting their gold around. So, they'd kicked out all of the colonial powers. France was the dominant power. They kicked out. They've got the Russians as their bodyguards, basically, fighting their wars. So yeah, it's a bit of a gnarly part of the world to mine in.
That's right. I mean, there are some relatively stable jurisdictions in Africa. I mean, there's a lot of gold mining activity in Ghana, and some local companies. Perseus, for example, has done very, very well and seems to have a very good relationship with the community and the lawmakers.
The community is not the problem. I mean, Resolute has got had a brilliant relationship with the local communities. The people who came in were actually not from Mali to start with. So they had come in from neighboring countries as part of that initial attack. So a lot of the problems are not necessarily internal. They come in from neighboring countries, as they do. And there's a lot of intertribal issues going on that even if you live there, difficult to understand.
Here's some rapid-fire questions. Are you ready, Clayton?
I'm ready.
When you think about people who've shown great leadership, whether it be in business or sport or the creative arts, who do you first think of?
Currently, Rassie Erasmus. I think he's just phenomenal how he's brought not a team together, how he's brought a country, 60-odd million people across racial groups, previous soccer fanatics. He's brought them all together through values and an ethos that I don't think is touched anywhere globally at the moment.
Interesting choice. What's a non-fiction book that you found very valuable as you've navigated your own career and developed your leadership skills?
Competing for the Future. I think it was Hammer and Pralad, if I'm not mistaken, are the authors. Is something that I would recommend anyone. It's a bit dated now, but the principles in it still remain true.
Would that book be available in bookshops today?
It should be, yes. I'd be very surprised if it's not.
Okay, interesting. What's an unpopular opinion that you hold? I'm pretty anti-woke. So I think currently that rates up there for unpopularity with certain groups. And what's the best career or business advice you've been given?
Never become someone else's victim. What that simply means is that if you are going to compromise your values just to protect your job, as an example, you are always going to be a victim to that person who got you to compromise those values. I have never compromised my values. I have lost, as a consultant back in South Africa, I have lost work because I was not prepared to compromise my values and pay backhanders. It's just not worth it.
Finally, what advice would you give your 25-year-old self in terms of how to lead a better quality life?
I've always joked that there are three things in order of importance. Number one is family. Number two are holidays. Number three is your profession. And don't get me wrong, I love what I do. I've got a massive passion for it. But at the end of the day, my job pays for holidays with my family. So to me, it's all about balance. Work, I've seen people destroy their lives by being overly committed to chasing a career and chasing promotion. It's not worth it. You can't take it with you.
Talking of holidays, you're heading off next week?
Yes, my wife and I are hitching up our little caravan, and we're off to the north, going to Quabba, going to Exmouth, places where we can just unwind and listen to the sounds of nature as opposed to the traffic.
Good on you. Look, have a lovely holiday with your wife. Clayton, thanks for being a guest on Hearts and Minds. You've got a fascinating story and background. As I said before, one of the most well-travelled people that we've ever had on the podcast, and you bring interesting perspective on leadership and engagement and culture. So thanks for being a part of the program.
David, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here. It's you don't often get a chance to talk about things that are passionate, part of your makeup, and the opportunity is fantastic, and there's lots more where that comes from.
Yeah, good on you. And thanks to Ben and the crew at Podwave Studios for making this episode happen. See you next time.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Hearts and Minds. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a rating or share it with a friend. And don't forget to follow us and connect on social media for updates on all of our upcoming guests. I'm Alana Bray-White, and I look forward to you joining us for our next episode.